I'm a social psychologist, right? So I believe that people are inherently bad, this isn't our students, at predicting what they're going to do in a new situation, right? We have decades of research on this fact that we are very bad at predicting what we're going to do in new situations. All of us, when saying, would you buy this item if it cost $12.46 and had these 3 features? Another part that he didn't talk about, that's what the research we used to do about new product development was about. What should be the price point and will we buy it at that price point? What they realized about after 50 years of doing that research, people were horrifically bad about knowing what they'll actually do in that situation when the price point comes around and the product comes around. And so I think that one of the places they've gone, this notion of variability is important. I'll make another analogy here. We act as if our students have a very clear idea of what they want and they can tell us what that is. And I would give as my example of this our pre-nursing students, right? Students default into this idea of pre-nursing, so we make the assumption that thousands of students want to be nurses. Because essentially that's the option they see in front of them as the thing that's going to get them a job and the thing that's going to get them a career. We have lots of things that would give them jobs and careers. And so I think it's this idea of, and I'm a huge fan, I've been a fan of segmentation for long before I saw this video, of understanding your different student segments differently. You go back to where I started about the idea, and maybe this was this morning, I talked about when you look at students who come into community colleges, they have, and Pat was talking about this, Dr. Donahue, about we have very different missions and segments of students, right? We have students who come in who are clearly on a transfer pathway. We have students who are at the other end of what we suppose is a spectrum, which is they're clearly in career technical programs. And that, by the way, is an incredibly hollow distinction. I said this to the earlier group, like, what percentage of your students are actually career technical? About 99.6% of them. They're not here for the love of learning. You weren't in college for the love of, maybe you were in college for the love of learning at some point. Well, most of these students are in college because they at some point want a job. Some of them are here to take 1 or 2 classes to get a job, a 1-year certificate, a 2-year degree, a 2-year certificate, a 4-year degree, or 9 years. But at the end of that, all of them want a job, right? So this distinction of career tech versus transfer is a little hollow. But I would also say that we have this segment of students, so we did this in California, this segmentation study, that, similar to what Malcolm was talking about, where we looked at the course-taking behaviors of all of the new students who came into the California Community College system in the fall of 2006. We followed them for 2 years. And we ran them into a big cluster analysis, exactly what he was just talking about, trying to identify the clusters of students. You guys are in like the packaged goods retail capital of the world, so all of you ex-Nescafe and folks who've worked in that world know about this. But we went in and we did this cluster analysis and we extracted these clusters of students. So we found transfer-focused students, we found cohort-based CTE type program, career technical focused students, we found non-credit students. We've further found this really interesting group. These are students that came in, they took exactly 1 or 2 courses at their community college. They left and we never saw them again, and they had a 95% course success rate in those courses. Not all 1 and 2 course takers had a 90, but this group did. And so I ask you, think about this group for a second. They come in, they take 1 or 2 courses, they're highly successful, we never see them again. What does the public, the legislature, and kind of public perception think those students are taking? What do you think are the top 3 departments the public thinks they're taking? They actually don't think that. That's what they are taking. They think they're taking art, fitness, and like languages to travel to Europe. This is the public perception of community college, is that one of its role, and by the way, lifelong learning, so I would refer to that, what they think it is this lifelong learning segment, has historically in many states been part of the community college mission. Many states it's been attacked, right? In California it's essentially gone because they only fund the system at a certain level. But what they're actually taking, what are the top 3 departments they're really taking courses from? Computer/IT, business, and accounting. So who are these students? Why are they coming to us? Jobs, right? They probably already have jobs, right? So it's career advancement, it's like career retrain. Not all of them are like this. By the way, you know what almost none of them are taking if you eliminate summer term? Math and English. Almost nobody comes to take 1 or 2 courses in math or English. Right, which should point out to us that that happens in the summer, by the way, because you have lots of reverse transfer students coming from 4 years to say, I don't want to take intermediate algebra at the university, it's going to cost too much, I want to take it at the community college. So you have to eliminate summer. But if you look at single course takers during the year, so here's the kicker to this group. How big do you think that group was as a percentage of 100 entering students in fall 2006 that were in this career advancement, career training group? 1/3 of community college students in California, across the entire state. Now it would be less now, because there's been policy changes that make it harder for those students to have enrollment priorities to enroll. Like, we've had serious limitations on the number of courses we can offer in California, because California brilliantly 50 years ago decided our funding model, what we're going to do is, colleges, you don't keep your tuition, we get it all at the state level, and we're going to give it back to you in apportionment per full-time equivalent student, but we're going to cap that every year. So think about that for a second. So if you're at a California community college, and let's say, for the sake of argument, you had 10,000 full-time equivalent students last year, this year you can't serve 12,000, you can only serve 10,000, or you're not going to be funded for the extra 2,000. Talk about a perverse system of incentives. Like, there's absolutely no incentive to do what I'm about to talk about, which is invest in students to get more of them to succeed, right? So we've got this model where it's really a challenge. So we've actually moved a lot of these students out, but a third of the students fit that profile. And so it's a group, by the way, that is absolutely invisible from all success rate and completion rate discussions. I don't know how big it is in New Jersey. My guess is it varies by region. Those of you who are regions who serve more business and industry type areas, you're going to have more of these students. It's one of my worries about performance-based funding models, is those students are going to be invisible, and they're never going to count as successes. We have a really hard time identifying those students, by the way, until afterwards, because we don't have a great way to get a hold of them. But that's another segment. I think it's an important segment to pay attention to, because if you look at the wage gains, by the way, you do look at labor market outcomes, that particular group averaged a $10,000 wage gain in their first year after those 1 or 2 courses. A really untold segment of the student community college. Now, I wouldn't argue we should get defensive about the completion rate argument based only on this population, but I do think, leading back into the video, we got to think differently about the segments of students. Our students are on a variety of trajectories, as Dr. Donahue was saying, and we got to be a little more savvy about tracking progress by where they start on the trajectory and where they're trying to get to. So I think it's an important point. Any other questions, any reactions to the Gladwell video? Anything strike you in there? Again, I come out of it with we got to ask different questions is my number one take home there. And I do blame also Moskowitz for there being 45 versions of Ragu. I just want to tell you that that's not something I'm happy about. So I get the last period of time here. I'm going to try to do this in like 35 minutes. This is the fascinating topic. Let's talk about money now, right? It's a post-dinner conversation. So what this is about is what I call the economics of innovation. So we just talked in the earlier session about doing things differently, right? If we're going to improve completion rates, it's not going to be by doing things the same old way with the same old model. Okay, so let's say for a second we actually got a little farther down the path of what are these alternate models we could do. Many of them, by the way, are perceived to be more expensive. So let's talk about this notion of cost for a second. And I did this, by the way, originally under the umbrella of stat weight, quant weight, when people asked, how can we afford the $100,000 per year that, by the way, it's an overestimate of how much it costs to be in stat weight, quant weight, but if I have to pay $100,000 a year, how is this going to be something I can actually afford to do? And so let's talk about this idea of the economics of innovation. So we're going to talk a little bit about the backdrop. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. I want to get into this. What are the fiscal considerations of innovative programs? I've actually developed a customizable Excel model that you can download if you're really bored and use. I don't want to get into that too much, but let's talk about this a little. So you guys know this. I'm going to move through this quickly. Community college completion rates for minority students are 34%. For white students, it's closer to 50%. 55 to 85% required dev ed as we currently measure it, and I would argue pretty strongly that maybe we should measure it differently. Here's another big one. 80% of high-income students enter college. Only 29% of low-income students enter college. And this next one, which is the kind of what to me was the biggest epiphany I've had in the last 6 months, was when I saw this slide, which actually gets at the issue of college being a merit. So we have this idea that college is a meritocracy. The smart students will get through, and the weaker students will weed out. This is a slide that shows you how the highest income quartile of students does in college graduation rates versus the lowest. And it's divided by high scores on tests versus low. Again, test scores aren't the best way to do this, but it's something we have. So what this says is, if you're in the highest income quartile, so the top 25% of income, and you have high test scores, you have a 70% college graduation rate. If you are in the lowest ability level as measured by tests, you have a 30% graduation rate. Not as good, but it's still better, by the way, than the top ability group from the lowest income quartile. Only 26% of them graduate. So if college is a meritocracy, we got a problem here, right? We've got this group of students who are high score students who are not getting through college. Now, there's a lot of reasons for why they're not getting through college. I would argue a lot of this has to do with financial stability. And I have this project I'm working on that'll hopefully get some stuff into the field in the summer.
So they're not high score students within their quartile.
It's overall. Yep, you got it.
High score students on the left and high score students on the right are scoring.
Same ability. So these are the same ability going into college. They graduate at 70%, these graduate at 26%. This, for me, is like the biggest thing I've seen that worries me in any piece of data I've seen, maybe in the last couple of years, is that this is as disparate as it is, right? My son is dyslexic. He's 10 years old. He's a great kid. He's got a lot of advantages to him. His dyslexia is a challenge. He is probably, if he wants to, he'll graduate college, because I'll help him navigate all the systems. I'll put him in the right place. He'll have the resources he needs. He'll graduate college. I guarantee you, on the high score, low score thing, will be in the low score group. He'll graduate college fine, right? But I think about, the families of low-income students to be able to, know how to navigate college. I mean, just first time in college alone, much less low income. How to navigate college, how to pick the right college, how to make sure your student's not getting screwed by the system. Like all those things that people who've been to college or work in colleges know how to do. These folks don't have that, right? And then the financial stability side in general, I think, is a big issue. So I mention this as a backdrop to the work we're doing. We actually can do some things to help low-income students have higher graduation rates. Why haven't we historically? I would argue it's largely, I'll talk about in a second what I think it is. A lot of it has to do with cost. We have to change some things to serve low-income students differently, right? And these things may cost. So let's talk a bit about that cost in a minute. I would also argue innovative programs exist on every campus. We've got IR data that suggests that many of these programs are effective. But they tend to be, and by the way, every single one of your colleges, every college in this country has 2 or 3 innovative programs. The problem is, for most of those innovative programs, how many students do they serve? 30, 40, 50, 60 students, which is fine if you have 120 students at your college, but you probably have thousands, right? Most of our innovative programs only serve small numbers. We wonder why those overall success rates haven't changed with these innovative programs in the last 5 years. I'd say there are 2 main reasons. One is, for the most part, they're really small. Right? They're innovative and they're with a small number of students. And the second is the overall population is experiencing a model that really hasn't changed in 400 years. Right? Our model of education worked great in Oxford in the 1600s when only the rich and the ruling class went to school. And it didn't matter whether you graduated or not, you were already a member of the rich and ruling class. And you fast forward to the 20s in America, 1920s in America, college didn't look that much different. You could probably go even into the 30s. But what do the 2 things that changed in the American higher education system that changed this? GI Bill. The GI Bill is number 1, and community colleges are number 2. We democratized higher education. You talked about it earlier. We democratized higher education in this country. One problem we have still is the model of higher education is the 400-year-old model. It's, by the way, based primarily on students finding themselves in college. I love this term. We need to let students find themselves in college. Which, by the way, we have evidence suggesting works really well for the 10% of students who can, A, do that in our system, and B, have the resources to swirl around for as long as they want and find themselves. For the other 90%, most of whom, by the way, are these students, they don't have the luxury of swirling through the college. They need to get a return on their investment. And they need to have that to happen sooner rather than later. So I think this idea that the idea that I think we need to take out of this is we do need to change the model. And I think we have examples of what to do. So let's talk about the cost side of this, though. So why have things not changed? So this is like, all right, so for a while ago you could say people didn't know about the literature, right? We didn't know what the other models were. There wasn't a great national literature. I think now we've kind of gotten past this one. Folks at Columbia, MDRC, lots of folks nationally, AACC. The literature is more well known. It's still an issue, but it's not as big of an issue as it used to be. We need paradigm shifts in campus administrators, faculty, staff, and I would throw trustees on here too. That we, as we said for the whole first session, we need to think differently about the questions we ask and what are the outcomes that we measure. I think that is a piece of it. Org change issues, I've worked in org change now for 20 years. Org change is hard no matter where you are, and it's probably harder in higher ed than it is in industry. At the end of the day, in industry, whoever's in charge can help say, we're going to do this, and we're going to look at it, and we're going to change this process to this outcome. We have a harder time doing that in higher ed. The lack of IR resources, that's not a big, this is one of my favorites, a pilot mentality. I use this phrase, death by pilot, which is this thing where we give an innovative faculty member or staff member a limited set of resources, 30 students in a semester, and say, tell us how this goes. with no plan ever of thinking what happens if it goes well, or learning and letting it grow over time from what happens if it doesn't work. And I would argue that a lot of this has to do with this notion of scaling, about the idea of innovating at scale, which is a phrase we use in completion by design a lot. Not creating more and more programs for 30 students, but thinking, what can we do for the 5,000 students? Well, how do we change that model? But I'd say at the end of the day, perhaps the single biggest reason is the perceived cost of scaling the programs to some or all students. We think, by the way, I asked this question earlier to the practitioners. There's a group of students who comes into most of your campuses every fall who are gen ed transfer type students who has a success rate that is double the other entering student population. Any ideas who that group is? It's a group of students, most of you have them, who have double the completion rates. What is that? See, it's actually not seniors. Returning students is one of the hypotheses here. They actually, in many cases, it's interesting about returning students. Returning students have much better graduate rates of completion of certificates. They don't have better rates of graduation for degrees. And I think we can analyze that and say why. They're better at certificates because they know what they need, they're motivated to get it, and it's tied to what they've already learned about in the workplace. The degree side's tough for them because A, it takes too long. We don't give much assessment of their prior learning, and by the way, many of the things they did 10 years ago and have to come back and do, we don't count toward their degree. It's actually harder for returning students to go down a degree path because they're already working. So it's not returning students. I'll give you, it's late in the evening. The answer is actually athletes. Think about that for a second. Athletes is actually the answer to this question. By the way, this is not the four-year Division I basketball and football problem that we all know about. This is community college athletics. The average athlete in community colleges, their graduation rate is in the 70s. 70% rates at most of your colleges. Why are athletes more successful? Shout them out. There's like 10 reasons. Small group. They got a cohort, right? There's one. What else do they have? Coaches and connections. I like to term coaches, it's not very pithy, institutional agents invested in their success. Someone,
coach not just meaning the athletic.
Right, I understand. Yeah. What else? Regimented schedule, structured schedule. They know what they're going to take. Yeah.
They have to keep passing their courses if they want to play.
They have motivation. You got to, if you're going to play, you have to keep a GPA requirement. What are some other ones? They're competitive. Yeah, there's a competition built into them. They have a stripe. I think that's a good one. Another thing they have, which I think is really interesting, is they have a ticking time clock. You start playing your first semester, you got 5 years to get it all in. And I submit to you that your average time to degree being 3.5 to 4 years doesn't really work for the athlete. Right? You take 4 years to get through the community colleges, you aren't playing 2 years at the four-year school. Right? And so I mentioned this, I mentioned for a couple reasons. One is I think it's interesting to see the feature of athletes and why they're so successful, because on average, by the way, they are quote unquote less academically prepared than your other entering students. Some of the colleges in this country, they represent nearly all of the diversity at the campus. I could name some of those colleges where they talked about getting rid of athletics. I'm like, you willing to become the whitest campus in the entire state? Because that's what happens if you get rid of athletics. And those students are highly successful. Other colleges, I point out, if you took your athletes out, your underrepresented minority graduation rates would be atrocious. We already have this so-called achievement gap, which I would argue is an achievement. But if you took out the athletes from that, try looking at your success rate for African American males, by the way, who are not athletes. It's really low. And by the way, it doesn't have to be that way. There are lots of things we can do about this. But the point of all of this is we do a lot of things for athletes we don't do for other students. You know, they have coaching, they have sometimes athletic counseling. I'm telling you, they know what courses to take. They're not wandering through the curriculum. They have all these things. One thing I will say about that ticking time clock, we have a new kind of thing that's happened to the community colleges in the last couple of years. It's really changed our world, and we haven't reacted to it, I think, very strongly, which is that all of our students are now on a ticking time clock if they're on financial aid. 100% of them have to finish all of their work in basically the same 5 years the athletes have, right? And so if we have this huge coming issue that I don't think we've gotten our heads around yet. If we have average time to degree of 4 years in the community colleges, and then students are going to transfer, they're going to run out of financial aid. And I'd argue it's going to be our fault, right? And I'll take that on and say, we can do some things to get those students through more quickly, so they get through in 2.5 or 3 years, so they still have financial aid. By the way, really powerful data on what happens to students who have financial aid and then lose it. The vast majority of them drop out and never complete. right? So we've got this is all the backdrop to this of why we need to do things differently. The story with the athletes, I think, what the question that comes up there is, what can we do differently for our entire population that's more like what happens for athletes? I'd argue some of the easy answers there are the notion of more structured pathways, more intentional support. You can go down some other paths, having someone that's like a coach involved in their success, the idea of coaching or mentoring, better strategic advising. There's lots of things we can do. All of those things, though, by the way, have a cost associated with them. I would argue that it's, again, very easy to blame the student, blame K-12, blame the parents, blame all of this for the system that produces these inequities. And we have all these things on the line, but here's the story at the end of the day. Community colleges have to pay their own bills. So we're left with a story where society and demands as we see it in our mission, and I have Dev Ed here because that's what we were talking about at the time, but we'll make this more general. Our funding system seems to suggest that we can't afford to do so. And I say seems to suggest for a reason. So let's talk for a second about what are the ways to think about community college funding. So I would argue, and this is just Rob's view of the world, it's in line with the view of other people who do this work. I'd say there are 6 ways to think about the fiscal aspects of colleges. One, we'll go through these as a cost analysis, where we just look at the incremental cost of doing things differently. We're very good at this, by the way. We are excellent at saying, this is too expensive, we can't do this, because we're only focusing on the costs. The second one's a little more interesting, cost effectiveness or return on investment analyses. And those of you who are trustees are more used to seeing this in your real worlds. If you're going to invest in a new piece of equipment or a new marketing campaign, you know ahead of time what you need to get on the other end to pay for that. Right? What the response rate is you need on a marketing campaign, what the increase in customer lifetime value you need on that side, you know those things. We don't do this much in higher ed. Then there's the whole question of cost efficiency this gets to the notion of what does it cost to produce a graduate at your college? This, by the way, is very sobering data of what it costs. We'll get into this in a second, but it's a scary number that most presidents and trustees don't want me talking about, and we'll talk about that in a minute. It's actually not a fair number in some sense. But there's also these issues that are on the student side, cost reductions per student. If you get students through in 3 years versus 4 years, they save money on books and tuition. And that money is not trivial to your students. Average of a couple $1,000s a year on that side, right? Sometimes more. There's also this interesting issue of wage gains for students. The idea that if you get students into the marketplace earlier, they're getting additional wages that they wouldn't have got if it took longer, okay? So I'm going to talk about 2 of these. This is kind of the cost analysis approach, is the idea of what does it cost to do things differently. So we do this really well, as I mentioned. This is all the things, if we do things differently. So let's say we're going to do a program that serves low-income students differently, where we're going to make sure they have structured advising every semester. We don't currently have that. We're going to take our low-income students, and all of them, and meet with them 3 times a semester to make sure they have what they need. Okay? So there's a cost associated with that, right? In this particular case, it's going to be the cost of incremental salaries. There's probably not a lot of other things on this one, if that's the specific example. If, the other examples that may come in here are things like when we go into a new program like a Statway, Quantway, we think about the release time. We got to pay faculty to do something new. And by the way, that often is something that we do, is pay release time. The point of all of this is, by the way, we can actually estimate all these costs for something new that we do. If you're going to run a different program, you can figure out what it's going to cost to do things differently. And again, I would point out, we're actually not that bad at doing this, because we say things cost too much. The problem is that we don't do this, which is not only look at the costs, but what happens when our students are more successful. Okay, so what happens when our students are more successful? This is more ROI. I would argue fairly uncommon in higher ed. We got some challenges I'll talk about as we get into it. So we're set up to think, you guys see these, you guys were talking about seeing these budget numbers all the time, right? You sit in the trustee meetings, you're seeing budget numbers all the time. We're set up to think in terms of fiscal periods. Usually it's fiscal years. So the idea is this year's salaries, fixed costs, and variable costs seemingly need to be offset by this year's revenues. What do you get revenue from in New Jersey? You get tuition. You guys keep your tuition, right? You get apportionment from the state. You guys know what that is roughly per FTES? Oh, is it different for every college? 1,500, 2,000, somewhere in that range for you guys? 1,700. Okay. Yeah, so that number varies by college, and that's actually, some certain states it varies by program, which I like, by the way, that they actually pay you more apportionment for a nursing program than they do for another one. But this is basically what your revenue is. You guys have other sources of something. You may have local bonds, county bonds, right? So there's a fixed, is that a fixed amount or is it based on enrollment? Whatever they want to give you. We go to them with open hands. Different counties, different counties. What percentage is that last part of your overall budget?
17.
So it's in the 15 to 20% range. Yeah, that's about, I think that's what I'd heard. So a little higher at yours, okay? Some counties zero. The zero's harder. But for the most part, a couple of those sources, the tuition and the apportionment revenue is not fixed, right? It varies by your enrollment. Do you guys have a smoothing factor in New Jersey where it's a certain, yeah, so it's smoothed over a 3-year average or something like that? No, it's base funding smooths it. Okay, so you can drop a little and it doesn't drop below a certain number for a couple of years. Idea on the apportionment? Yeah, so this varies in every state, by the way, and this model I've created can deal with any of that stuff. So we could think about this a little differently. So we know what it costs to deviate from our traditional model. We can measure that. But the question is, if we think about the revenue we get, the revenue changes. So here's the costs. We talked about this side already. But here's the flip side. What happens if students are more successful? What do we get? Well, we get increased course retention. We get increased course success rates. We get increased persistence, increased progression to college level work, and an increase in overall units attempted and earned, right? There is, by the way, one of those myths that is sitting out there is that community colleges benefit from the swirl that students have in Dev Ed. That we're actually making money by letting all those students swirl in Dev Ed because we're getting all the tuition and apportionment from it. Which is, you know, on the surface, by the way, would be true if all Dev Ed students graduated. Yes, we would get all the money of their 60 college level credits plus all the money from their Dev Ed courses. The problem is most Dev Ed students don't graduate. So we spend a lot of money up front to get them in the door and they drop out. Most of them drop out. So we actually don't collect the revenue. Where do you spend most of your money on a student in their life cycle? So as a student comes into your college, where do you spend most of your money on them? It's all front loaded, right? Almost all of our services are front loaded. All of the intake, all of the orientation, all of that is front loaded. We front load almost all of the costs. 80% of the cost of serving a student are front loaded. And so when students leave after we've spent all that money on them front loading, it's a horrifically inefficient model, right? The profit, and I don't like thinking of things solely in terms of fiscally. You can tell my passion's actually not in this side, it's in the other side of changing the world. But I actually think this is pretty important because one of the common arguments to why we can't do things differently is it costs too much. Okay, so let's pay some more. Let's say rather than spending $1,000 per student, we can argue what the number is, we spend $1,200 per student. We spend 20% more per student in that upfront cost. If we actually have increased persistence, progression to college level work, and overall units attempted and earned, you're going to get that back over time. And I've created this model so you actually can model what this looks like for a variety of programs. And what we actually find, by the way, and so I talk a little about F2S and tuition. Colleges in California, it's $4,300 per FTS, but remember, we don't keep tuition. So that has to be loaded for all the tuition. But even in California, it would work. In most colleges, you keep tuition and fee revenue. So the idea here is the incremental FTES and tuition generated in these other ways of doing things can offset the costs, right? So this is a question, do that actually offset the costs? So I've modeled this for a couple of times. There's a couple caveats here. We talk about the California enrollment cap. I will say this about the ROI approach, is your state doesn't currently cap the apportionment, but if you all of a sudden tomorrow do a fundamentally better job at increasing student success rates and student completion rates so that double the number of students are getting through, the question you might want to ask yourself is your state going to pay the apportionment for those students? So I think there's a policy issue here, and I would throw it out to Larry and others who deal in the policy world. If you're going to be held over the fire to improve your completion rates at your colleges, you might want to say back to the state, all right, if we work on this and it works, are you willing to pay 50% more in apportionment dollars per year? Because I worry about this, because I think at some point we're going to do a better job at this, and this ROI is going to fall a little bit short of where we thought it was, because we're not going to get as much per student. There's a story about this from Texas, which is basically, as they got better, they used to fund it at like $3,000 per student, but they wanted the overall number to be X. So when they got better at producing more enrollments, they moved it down to $2,600, so they could still pay X. If you get even better, they'll move it down further. So there is an issue here with this, which is that you have to be, there's a prisoner's dilemma here. Like at what point will your state legislator, I'm kidding, don't do that. Will your state legislator notice that as you're getting more successful, they're paying more? Depends on where they are. Yeah, so it's a fixed piece of the pie anyway. So it's just,
budget line.
right. So for you guys, the ROI comes around tuition, right? And you guys, if I remember correctly, have a fairly high tuition relative to other states, like $130 a unit? With fees, yeah. It's actually a fairly good amount of money. So that means on any student in a given year where they take 30 units, you're getting $4,000 in tuition revenue, right? So over 2 years, you're probably getting $8,000. And so the question you got to ask yourself is, even if you don't take the apportionment off the table for a second, because I think that is, as a fixed pot, it's kind of like your bond money. You get X, right? And I would say, though, that there's an efficiency story there. Would you rather serve this, like a smaller number of students better than a larger number of students? It's going to cost you less to serve the smaller number of students better. This is part of the problem with the enrollment game we play, is we treat the enrollment game as if all enrollments are the same. You pay a lot more for that first enrollment from a student than you do from their 45th unit, right? Yeah, there are instructional costs downstream on the 45th unit side, but I think the key here is to think about what happens. And by the way, these incremental FTEs aren't without costs. We do have to pay. So let's say we have many more successful students coming out of Dev Ed or coming out of the early stages. So there's actually an irony here that at many of our colleges, those students will just fill already classrooms that aren't full right now, right? Your upper division math courses, your GE courses. And if you have open seats, they'll take open seats, and essentially it's no cost to you. If you're a highly efficient college and you have no open seats, you're going to have to open additional sections, which does have an instructional cost, right? Now again, that's one of the things we also say, we can't do this, it's too expensive, we're going to have to pay faculty more. Yeah, you got to pay faculty more, but you're getting the revenue back on the tuition side and the apportionment side to some extent. There's also the issue of overhead and infrastructure costs. I've had a lot of conversations with budget folks about fiscal folks about this, and your incremental revenue that you get is not without cost of overhead, right? You have facilities to pay for, you have human resources, you have all of that stuff to pay for. It's pretty complex, but what I've done is, when I do this work, is I actually discount the future revenue by a certain amount to cover overhead. So you guys in the business world, this is cost of goods, right? Cost of sales, cost of goods, the cost of delivering the actual courses has a cost to it. But by the way, I will point out that if we were offering courses at a loss, historically, colleges would have gone out of business a long time ago. Any given section, if it's fuller, the more full that section is, the more it operates at a profit, right? So if you can open another full section from a revenue side, it almost always is going to pay for itself at your college, right? If it wasn't, we'd have these other issues with falling under the budget lines. So this is like an order of magnitude model. I'm just going to show you some quick results to what happens when I actually did this. So I did this for 6 colleges. I've done this a couple times now in a couple different projects. I did this in California. I used real-world data from colleges. So what I did is I tracked students under the old model, the traditional model, found 100 students under the traditional model. I tracked all their units in FTES for 3 years. Then I took the alternate model, which in this case in California at the time, there was one that was a tutoring, one was a learning community, one was a supplemental instruction, one was a kitchen sink model. And I followed those students for 3 years and tracked their tuition and fee revenue. And you found in every single case that the students who got the different program gave you more revenue because higher persistence, higher retention, they're around for longer. And it varied, by the way. The ROI varied on this, and I'll show you some numbers in a second, from a 6% return on investment to over a 38% return on investment. You were actually making a bunch of money on these students. It's actually even better here. So what I've done here real quickly, and I'm going to finish up the thought process here so we can open it up for conversation. I modeled 6 colleges, and I think one of them actually is from New Jersey, who were considering Statway Quantway, which is an alternate math pathways project. The costs with Statway Quantway are things like you have to pay for the network fee, let's say it's $25,000 to Carnegie. You got to pay for some travel for your faculty to go to the summer forum. We modeled all those costs, right? We modeled the cost of IR having to spend 5% of their time giving the data to the Carnegie folks. We modeled the stipends we gave to faculty to be in the program. We modeled all that, and it came out with a certain cost per year. And then we looked at what would happen if we got, say, a 15% improvement in FTES and revenue. At all 6 of the colleges, there was a profit from this program, and the ROI ranged from small to as high as 300%. And so I'm not going to, I could show you the model now, but it would take longer than we have. I think the point of this demonstration is that we very commonly are saying that this stuff costs too much, and I don't think we're thinking about the revenue considerations downstream. We talk about cost per student. We actually don't think about the revenue per student number. So because we invest so much of our money up front in folks, and many of those students don't last very long with us, it's not a very efficient way to recoup the revenue from it. And the idea is that if we spent a little bit more money and kept them for longer, you'd actually have an overall profit from this. Does this model make sense? Does this idea make sense to folks? Have you looked at this at your college, done the ROI type thing at your college on new programs? Miami-Dade, on the completion by design work, added 25 new advisors to serve this role, kind of we were talking about that the athletics coaches serve. 25, now they're huge, by the way. It's the largest college in the country, 100,000 students. So it sounds like a lot, and it is. It was $1 million a year to hire these 25 new advisors. It paid for itself in 8 months. They increased their retention rate from incoming freshmen by 8%, almost theoretically directly related to the adding of these 20. They did some other things too, but this was the cost side of it. They recouped that money back in 9 months. And that was the first time out of the gate before they really had the model figured out. So I think this way of thinking can be useful to us. I never lead with the fiscal side. I think the ethical and the moral responsibility we have are much higher issues. But for you guys, especially as trustees, this issue of cost is a big one, right? One other thing I'll say about cost is one of the other models is the way we think about cost per completer. So this is the idea that we can measure the effective program on incremental cost. And so the idea is we start seeing these metrics like cost per graduate and cost per completer coming in. And I think these are useful because when your accountability is requiring you to get more students to complete, what it actually costs to get you to have those students complete is an interesting question. And by the way, if you run these numbers over a community college budget, so let's just do this. One college, what's your overall college budget in a year?
70 million.
70 million. How many graduates do you have a year? Pass. Just guess. Someone. 1,100. You do the math on that, it's kind of a depressing number you end up with. It's a number that looks something like, if you just do it straight that way, which is the way people do this, it's like 75 grand per graduate, right? Which sounds like a ridiculous amount of money. Now, partially this is because of what Dr. Donahue was talking about earlier, is that we're lumping in the denominator of that, all the costs to serve different segments of students who aren't trying to graduate, right? Having said that, it's an interesting metric to take a look at what the cost per completer is, because if we spend a little bit more money and get 30% more completers, that number is going to go down. You can make an efficiency argument to your state that, yeah, we're investing a little bit more money here, but the overall cost to produce a completion is actually dropped. And so I think this is a useful tool when you're arguing at state policy levels. You got to be careful with it because a lot of people don't know the numbers very well. The challenge, of course, is it may cost more to produce those completions. Right? So if you don't think about the revenue side, it's only going to look like you're spending more money. Okay? So I'm going to stop here. What are some questions you guys have on this particular? Then we can kind of go back to the other side. Any questions you have about the kind of fiscal side of this?
Okay, I was hoping you'd keep your.
Oh, let's go back.
You had a chart up there. I think it was the figure 2 that
Yeah.
the 6 colleges.
Yep.
There was a real range between the 12
Yeah.
or 13% and the 300%.
Yep.
Wondered if you had, kind of pulled out what the critical differences were.
So one thing, this particular model is not based on actual data because Statway and Quantway don't have 3 years of data to track yet. Right? Most of those programs are really new. So what this actually represents is the increase they think they can get in time to degree and how much they thought they could get an increase in downstream revenue. So this college was more aggressive. What they said 2 things. The first thing they said was, we actually have a very horrible time to degree. It's like 5 years at this particular college. It's in another state. Their average time to degree is 5 years. So their idea of getting more students through more quickly had a bigger effect than it would at a college. And I had another college that I modeled, by the way, who said their time to degree was under 3 years. So we should study you because I never heard of a college, and community colleges has a time to degree under 3 years. So it had to do with how aggressive they were. The other thing they did is they had almost no costs. Right? Remember, ROI is relative, and so they said, we're not paying faculty stipends. They had a grant to pay for the network fee. So the cost side went down so much that they actually, the combination of these 2 things led to, when I looked at the actuals, so I had the actuals from California in the study I did like 8 years ago. The ROI, the actual ROI ranged from 6% to 47% based on, and the difference was the program that produced a 47% ROI was highly expensive, but it was highly effective. Right? They paid a lot more. It was literally the kitchen sink. It had like weekly advising meetings. It had a counselor in every classroom. It went to the full other end of the spectrum. It still paid for itself because it was dealing with a population who had like 12% completion rates before they started this. And they got them to go through at a much higher rate. But even the one that served 6%, that was a much bigger program. So one of the other things this doesn't take into account is how big these programs are. So size is a big issue. Yeah?
Your point on the front load is well taken, but it seems just right off the top because the costs are front loaded.
Yep. Persistence
And retention, as you go out each semester on through there, that margin actually widens out.
Absolutely it does.
And that's, I guess, who has been successful out of your Aspen experience and your other experiences, who has been successful of, keeping them, the students in after semester 1, and then getting through to a period of completion, whatever that may be.
Great question. Walla Walla's in Washington. It's in the far eastern corner of Washington. It is in the middle of nowhere. Okay, Stephen Van Ostdale, their president. They've done some incredible things there. One of the things they did is they essentially created the entire wine industry in their region. 10 years ago, there were 12 somewhere between 7 and 12 wineries in that area. The college started programs in enology, built its own winery, and there's 137 wineries in that area now. It's made some ridiculous number of millions of dollars for the state. So they have really great career technical programs that they keep people in for longer that are tied to their industry. So that's one thing you're doing. The better you are tied into the industry in your region on the career tech side, the more you're going to get a group of students who come in and who are focused. But they do this other thing on the transfer side, is they monitor student progress and completion better than maybe anyone besides Valencia in the country. Every student at Walla Walla has to meet with a faculty advisor every semester to get a registration code to even register for the next semester. They require the advising of the students. It's not optional. And many of you think, I think live in a union state as I do. We had issues with talking about this in California because of the union side of this, but their faculty just took on this issue of, we're going to do this advising. And so they monitor progress. Like I talked earlier about how we don't monitor progress. They monitor it every semester at Walla Walla. The other thing they do there is they have what they call completion coaches. So they have student services folks they've actually hired who are dedicated to figuring out where the barriers are to students moving through and helping remove them. And some of those barriers are financial. They also have, many of our colleges have foundations. They use their foundations in dollars in Walla Walla for exactly one purpose, and that is to give grants of up to $1,000 to students who are in their last semester who run into financial difficulty. They're called completion grants. They work incredibly well. They spend about $60,000 a year on these things to about 100 students a year. Nearly all of those students graduate. Many of those students would have dropped out. So they just do a number of things along the way. And so Walla Walla is one, Valencia is the other one. The places that, in Valencia is in Orlando, first winner of the Aspen Prize. They have their life map thing that they do, where it's kind of an educational planning all the way throughout, but they're monitoring progress each semester to see where students are on that pathway, and they intervene. So I think it's the places that are using their data better that you would say, Georgia State's another great example of this. Georgia State and Florida State in the four-year space. Georgia State has this program, I don't remember the name of it, but they have established markers for success in all of their 70-degree programs. There's about 10 markers for success in each of the programs, and there are things like pass this course by a certain semester or get through this course. They have a system that's set up so that when one of those markers is not hit, it automatically triggers a response from the college. So no student falls through the cracks there. One of the things I said in the morning session is I asked, who at your college knows when a student who was here fall semester is not here in the spring? Does anyone actually know how many of them there were? And if they do, who they were and why they dropped out? It's invisible right now. It's really easy for students to roll really easy and drop out. The answer, by the way, to groups of students who do know that are your coaches for athletes and your career tech programs or cohort-based career tech programs. They all know when students drop out. And I point out we have higher completion rates from athletes and from career tech programs. We're monitoring progress there in a way we don't in the gen ed curriculum, right? So I think it's the places who've done that, who've kind of moved down this path of, how many students dropped out in the fall? Why did those students drop out? This goes back to what Gladwell was saying, I think, that we assume, by the way, if you ask those students why they dropped out, they'll tell you a reason, and it's almost always the dating reason. It's not you, it's me. Really wasn't anything you did, it was me. And it's because they actually don't know what would have happened if they had a better set of conditions to get through. They're not good at knowing. You ask them what would they have been able to use. And they actually will tell you some interesting things. By the way, what they tell you are things like, I need better programs, I need you to tie me to programs better, I need increased structure, I need better student services. They will tell you some of that. But for the most part, I would argue we don't monitor the progress of these students. The places that do have higher completion rates. Florida State is by the most draconian example of this. Florida State they don't even talk about freshman, sophomore, junior years anymore in their academic side of the house. They talk about what they call MAP terms. So on the academic map that leads to a 4-year degree, by the way, every student who enrolls at Florida State picks a program. Same at Georgia State. One of the other things that's happening in the community college, this is in all that AACC stuff, the idea of managing things by the program level. At Florida State, you pick a program. And if you miss the markers for success, the MAP term things you need to do in any given term for that program, you can do it once. You get called into mandatory advising. They talk to you about what's going on. It's not to try to weed them out. It's to say to them, we saw you had some trouble. You didn't meet your markers for moving forward. How can we help? How can we get you back on track? So they give them another semester. If they miss it again, they have to change majors. End of story. This goes back to the pre-nursing example, right? They're basically saying, we're not going to let you go down this path and not be successful. It sounds draconian, and the first thing I asked is, how'd that work for low-income students and students of color when you did that? Are you just weeding them out of the other majors? They actually have closed the so-called achievement gap at Florida State. There is no achievement gap between African American and white students at Florida State. Partially, they think because they've done this, where when students are moving down a path that they're not going to be successful on, they catch them early and either redirect them on that path or get them onto a path they can be successful on. So I think the colleges that do these type of things, that's where you're going to see more of a return on this investment, because they're seeing this idea of monitoring the progress as a tool. I don't think they think of it this way about recouping their investment. That's essentially what they're doing at that time. What are some other questions?
All this argues for something that community colleges don't have, and that's some kind of an endowment fund. Because one of our problems is that all this is very good in theory, but when you're faced with decreasing subsidies from county and state government, it is very hard to, when all your other revenues, not tuition, are up front as well. It is extremely hard to model according to what you're saying. If we had a better independent source of revenue that we could rely on, you could do exactly what you're saying, and it would be a much better.
Yeah, I see what, to have that to smooth over the rough spots, I think would be incredible. I would argue, though, that it is only through recouping this investment downstream that you're going to be able to survive with decreased investments from the state and from your local areas. I mean, if that number is fixed, you have two choices. Serve fewer students, and I don't know how we figure out a way to do that, by the way, because you got equity and access issues there. If you don't serve fewer students, your only other option is to recoup the investment from the ones you've already made the investment in. So I get where you're coming from. And by the way, people worry when they do things like mandatory advising, mandatory student success, mandatory orientations, that they're going to lose enrollment. Interesting on that most places who've tried that, it actually hasn't reduced enrollment, partially because this is one of those things that goes back to what Gladwell was talking about. We assume that by requiring students to do things ahead of time, they're not going to come. Most high school students will do what you tell them to do when they come to us, right? They've just gotten away. I don't mean that they're getting away with something. They can do whatever they want right now. They can not take things. They can take things. And so this idea that they're not going to respond to our creating structure for them, I think is somewhat fallacious. And the data suggests from colleges who've tried to do these things differently, they haven't seen huge drops in enrollment. And so maybe part of it, and even if you did, you could foresee a world in year one you drop 10% in enrollment, but you gain 30% in year 2 and 3. It would be a one-year problem, right? But I get the issue of you have to pay for, and again, if your state resets your base in that year, you had all those issues that come into it. But I think for you guys, because your tuition is so relative, and I don't mean high, I'm not trying to say it's too high, but it's relatively high, that you have that built-in revenue generator from keeping students longer. If you can get 45 units per student instead of 15, yeah, you have costs to serve the 45. You got to offer some more classes. But the math on it works out in most situations that you're far better off financially getting 45 units from a student than 15. But I see your issue. Yeah, having something to smooth it over. I mean, at some point, there's a minimum cost, a minimum amount of revenue we need to serve a student. And if we cut off too much, we're going to go below that. We've talked about this in California more because we don't have tuition. And the state keeps cutting that overall number. There's some point at which we actually only can serve students if we serve them poorly. Right? And so that's not a popular conversation in the state policy arena. But yeah, so I think it's a real issue.
You said you are wildly
Yeah.
optimistic about the community college role in
I am.
this. These issues are complex, but you're an optimist about it all. What are the main reasons for your optimism?
Because I think this Aspen Prize experience I've had of having gone around this country and seen these colleges, and they're not these mythical things that are happening somewhere that could never happen here. And so you look at a Valencia, a Walla Walla, a Santa Barbara, Brazosport in Texas, which is this college in the southeast of Texas that serves the oil industry. They have incredibly high completion rates because they've done a really good job at tying into their industry. And on the general ed transfer side, they have probably the best college success course in the country. It's designed to really get and it's mandatory. All students take it. It's been designed by higher ed experts. So there are you see things across the country at these places. The Georgia State story to me is really, really transformational. They've increased their graduation rate by 22 points in 10 years. They have a fascinating slide on this, by the way. One of the things they did to do that, they do a bunch of things. They have mandatory learning communities for students in the first year. All students are in a learning community of 25 students. They travel together in blocks. Students have to pick a program. They don't pick courses. Schedules are more set. So when you look at the places who've taken these huge steps that are very far away from the traditional model, you see these outcomes that are very different, and they're much higher. Look up the road here. You guys have CUNY's ASAP program up the road. CUNY's got this, I don't remember what it stands for. It's an accelerated program, but students sign up for a track by major, right? It is a structured program. They sign up for a program, not a course. They take a block schedule, and the debate on block scheduling I know is rancorous at times, but they take courses all at the same time. They take them together. They have a lot of student support built in. They've doubled the graduation rate. Not the success rate in a course, but they've doubled the graduation rate from those students. And it works even better for underrepresented minority students. So I just look at these places, I say, they don't look like what most of our colleges look like, but that's okay because we're going to try to move in that direction. And so AACC's document they put out, I think, was highly instructive. I think the key features we're going to see, I talked a lot about the placement test. I submit to you that in 5 years, we will not be having these conversations. Because what's going to happen is the North Carolina data is going to come out, the data from Long Beach is going to come out, and I'm not a big legislative fiat guy as the way to change higher ed, but there's going to be a legislator in Iowa saying, when they see the North Carolina, let me get this straight. You can do this the old way, and you're going to get 18 to 20% of students to ever come out from 2 or 3 levels below, and it costs us so much to fund those dev ed courses. Or we could do it this way and use transcripts and GPA instead of placement tests, or use alternate models, and I can get 50% of the students through, and now they're taking courses I want to fund. They're going to legislate it. And it's happened. You talked about where it's happened in Florida and Connecticut. Those states aren't happy about pieces of that. But I don't think you're going to have dev ed looking like it does in 4 or 5 years. And so that's half of what I think that's going to happen. The other half is I think this issue of structured pathways is going to win out in the end. It's going to take a while, by the way, because many of your faculty, especially my colleagues in social science and humanities, do not like the idea of only teaching 4 courses in their discipline versus the 15 they currently teach. Now, I'll tell you that right out. We've dealt with this when we do redesign. I used to teach psych and law at a community college in California. I loved that course. My students loved it. I look back at it and saying it was an incredible disservice to them because it wasn't a course that was on any of their pathways. It was detracting their time from moving forward on what they needed to do. It should be a senior level course or a graduate course. So one of the things you got, and again, I say this with faculty in the room. There's not many faculty in this room. At some point, we got to decide who the college is here for. And it's not a comfortable conversation, by the way, and I know you guys are all squirming when you hear that. Yeah, you guys, yeah, and I love faculty. I work with faculty all the time. And by the way, they are not immovable on this issue. Miami-Dade had a very strong faculty senate, strong faculty union. They at some point got to the point of saying, you know what? We let them look at the data for 9 months. They investigated all the things that were going on. They identified all these barriers. At the end of the day, they said, you're right. We need to do something different here. We need to create a structure that is much more highly structured. They're doing the meta major idea, which is that students come in and rather than picking a specific degree program, they pick from one of 6 meta majors. City College of Chicago do this. Natural science, social science, business, humanities, health science, whatever the 6 are, and they get a structured experience in each of those to start that helps them pick where they want to go. I love that model too because when right now do students get to decide they don't like a field? It's 3 years down the road when they actually get into it. Why not give them an experience up front that helps them decide up front? I think this idea of how we use information, the data thing I was talking about, how do we monitor progress and celebrate it, I think all that's continuing to change. And so the combination of all of these things leads me to believe that the work you're all going to do, and by the way, I'm not going to be doing the work. The people on the ground of the colleges, you and your colleagues and your faculty and staff will be doing the work. We're going to change this. And I think we're going to see DevEd very different. We're going to see this program thing different. We're going to use technology to monitor progress very differently. We're going to see more programs that look like the outcomes of a Georgia State or an ASAP at CUNY, or these places, Valencia in Florida, who over a 10-year period doubled the number of graduates at a time where they had an enrollment increase of 40%. And I don't know about you, but most often when enrollment grows up, graduation rates go down, not up. Right? That's the common trend we see historically. You serve more students, actual graduation rate goes down. It's gone up. Not only did they serve 40% more students, they got 100% more graduates. And I think it's because of all the things they're doing that we're talking about a little bit here, this idea of structure, this idea of on-ramps to programs of study, monitoring progress. I just think it's going to be a very different world in 5 years. So that would be my general answer to that question.
Where can we see in writing the statistic on 70% of the athletes and your points on that? That is really valuable.
So I have some data on that from California. It's one I suggest to you. No one will believe it at your campus until you run it locally. So I can share it with you from my data, but you're gonna want your person to run that because no one will believe it.
Inquiry 2.
Yeah. Fire me an email. I'll put up my email address up here, and find my study on that because it's been a while.
And while you're doing that, you've been talking about Florida an awful lot. And if I recall, with Governor Bush, maybe 10 or 12 years ago, pretty much wiped out all of the boards of all of the colleges and put in new trustees everywhere. Given the makeup of this room,
I think that's a great idea. No, I'm kidding. I think the Florida story is less about the trustee overhaul, which did happen 10 or 12 years ago. I think the Florida story is more about state policy. You remember what you have in Florida that we don't have in most states? They have a common course numbering system and a common curriculum in Florida. There is no DevEd is different at my college than your college. It's the same everywhere. Intermediate algebra is the same course everywhere. Psych 1 is the same course everywhere. There is one articulation agreement in Florida, not 57. California, we have 113 community colleges, we have 23 Cal State universities, and we have 13 UC colleges. There is not a single articulation agreement that is not every single combination of those. Most states are more like that, so I think the Florida story is about a couple things. Pretty good data system, which is one piece of it, but I think the issue of the portability of courses in Florida, the common course numbering. When we do the Aspen Prize numbers, by the way, and we had to set a rule that says the top 120 are generated by an algorithm that calculates success rates based on iPads. We had to create a rule that said you can't have more than 50% of the colleges from one state in the top 120, because Florida would have had 25 of the 29. 25 of their 29 in the top 120. I don't think they're doing anything magically different overall in Florida. I think Valencia is amazing. Miami, there's some great colleges in Florida. There's some great colleges in New Jersey, right? And in the other states. So I think what Florida tells us is state policy matters. The idea of more seamless and structured pathways matter, and they've made that happen in Florida over time. So I think it's actually a really instructive case. The trustee thing, I think, I'm just going to be honest with you. I think you guys have a role in generating these conversations at your college. It couldn't be anywhere near that big of a role to have had that effect. I just think you guys sound like you have a much better system. The California system, I would argue that in the California system, half to 2/3 of the trustees are there for political reasons. They're not there because they want to support the education at the college. They're looking for a stepping stone into politics. And I think it's about half. It may be, I'm being nice, I think, actually, in the California story. And it's not that these are bad people, it's just that's not why they're here. And so I think in that model you have a question of where is the energy of trustees going to lie? What I've heard the comments from Bakari about what you guys have been talking about, I don't seem so worried about that here. So you go back to the first presentation about how do you play a role in changing these conversations? I think you play a huge role as trustees in changing these conversations on your campus. There's a fine line, and the presidents in the room, by the way, are probably thinking, I don't want you too involved in the day-to-day on the ground. And there's a fine line about this. But I think where I come back to trustees on this is you can ask different questions. You can ask to see different things in board meetings, not to hold people over the fire, but to really get this culture more developed, are we asking the right questions? Are we moving forward on the answers? And I think the board-president relationship is critical to making that happen in a way that faculty, staff, and administrators can still be engaged and energized and not feel as if they're being moved around by trustees and presidents. I think there's a way to do both. It's a fine line. Yeah.
Rob, just to, I guess maybe to.
Get 7. I'm on hour 13. What day is it?
Final takeaways. What would you?
Final takeaways. If I were you and you had a nurse, the first thing I would do is I would go back to your campus if you have a nursing program and do what Stark State did in Ohio. I think we need to play with this issue of pre-nursing students. That's an easy one, kind of a low-hanging fruit thing. I think my takeaway is, and I go back to the video on the Gladwell, I think we need to make sure we're asking the right questions. We need to make sure that what we're doing at the colleges are actually addressing, if we want to change student outcomes, we've got to ask different questions than we've been asking historically. You know, you want to probably see the enrollment report, but I think you want to see the student outcomes report more than you want to see the enrollment report. I think if that can change, that's the type of thing that can change. And if you want to talk about where the change has to come from in the colleges, I would throw it into the buckets of, we need to have more structured pathways and structured programs. We need to fix Dev Ed so that it leads into those programs. And by the way, if you just fix Dev Ed, you would only get a marginal bump in graduation rates because those other problems are so huge. We need to fix those too. So there's the Dev Ed, there's the on-ramp side, there's the structure side. I really think that we can be more savvy about how we use student data and customer data, like I was talking about. I mean, why not whenever a student passes the 50% threshold towards the degree, tell them, hey, great job, you're halfway there. Here's what you need to do still. That doesn't require a $10 million technology investment. You could do that type of stuff tomorrow. So I think the idea of how are we managing student progress is the other key takeaway on this. And that's something that you can, again, I don't know what the answer to that is on every campus. Maybe you do something different at your college than I would do at mine. But I want to know who are my student segments and how are they doing. And so, you know, if your college has more of those career retraining students, let's figure out a way to serve those students differently too. So if we're going to try to improve things, I think the main buckets are kind of the structure side, the on-ramps from Dev Ed, and then this culture of trying to think about how we manage student progress differently. Those are my three big takeaways. I would also take away from the second presentation, brief as it was, I don't think it has to cost more. I mean, I think we need to think differently about that piece. And by the way, maybe it does, maybe what you're thinking of, program B, does actually cost that much more. Maybe that's not the right program, but let's think about the revenue implication side of this too. I think we need to do both of those things. So, and I know it's 7:03, and I don't want to be here any longer than you do. So I'll stay around for a couple minutes for questions after. Thank you guys so much for your time and sticking through this in the afternoon. All right, man. Thank you.